Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly, sponsored by SignalWire. This week, our guest is Zachary Way, Senior Consultant at KiZAN Technologies, Microsoft partner, and longtime voice over IP expert. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Zach.
Thank you.
Would you like to give us a quick introduction about yourself, what you've been doing?
Yeah, so I've been working, I started my career mostly working in the VoIP industry for telecom uh, in Greensboro, North Carolina, called Pay Tel Communications. They do telecom software for jails and prisons. And we worked really heavily the last couple of years that I was there with porting our VoIP platform over to Asterisk. And we had a custom in-house IVR solution. Um, and then I've since moved on to different things. Worked a couple of years for a vehicle tracking company up in New York that did GPS tracking for fleet management software for mostly trucks and stuff like that. And now I work for KiZAN, which is we're a big Microsoft partner on the East Coast that does a lot of consulting for various different firms. Um, of everything from cloud-based solutions to custom application development.
Yeah, so I'll ask you later about the Microsoft environment because I think there's a lot of misconceptions in the open source community about what exactly you can do with Microsoft and open source. But
Absolutely.
there's a few questions like how does a prison phone system work in general? Like, what are the challenges there? Just curious because it's never come up before in the topic, and it's
Yeah,
interesting.
so it's actually really quite challenging. One of the biggest things that we had to deal with is the fact that most of these prisons and jails, the wires were run back when the prison was built. And some of these prisons were built back in like the 1950s, all the way up through maybe the 80s, if you're lucky. So they've maybe got a single two pair line run to
Wow.
the phone. And these phones are custom built phones because they have to be one hardened so that basically they can't break into the electronics inside the actual phone case. Two, the cords are like restricted to be roughly about 2 feet long or so, because that way they can't hang somebody using the cord
What?
or choke someone out. Yeah. So these are huge, like solid steel boxes. The buttons are solid steel. Like everything is steel construction except for the handset, which is like this really thick ABS plastic. And it's all built like that because of the fact that you can't have something that, one, they can rip off the wall and use as a weapon, and two, you can't have something that's going to be easily destroyed, because anything you put in a jail cell, they're going to destroy it. Um, so you have those two problems combined with the fact that um, a lot of the we I was we were working with a smaller telecom, so we mostly did prisons and jails that were in smaller counties. I think our largest facility at the time that I was working there was maybe around 2,000 beds, which is a really small, like, county sized facility. It's not like state prisons and stuff like that. So um, these jails typically had rural based internet access, so we would typically get like maybe a T1 line or a T3 or something like that. So we're dealing with older telecom um, based hardware solutions to get voice and everything like that back and forth to the prison. Add to that, we had all sorts of complexities with working the prison industry is just bizarre to begin with. W- and if you've followed the FCC fights over the past decade or so, there's a lot of fights over going over trying to figure out how to solve this problem. The industry was not very well regulated before, so we had things like people were charging 50 cents a minute for a phone call, and then what they would do is they would pay like 90% commission back to the jail. So the jail would make something like 48 cents a minute on the phone call, and then the prison telecom would get paid like 2 cents a minute. So
People will be
it's
making a killing of
oh yeah, they
people
were.
people in
It's
need, effectively.
Yeah, so it's since changed. Thankfully they've set like interstate rates, maximums and stuff like that. So it's not nearly as bad as it used to be, um, but it still has a lot of room for improvement. And then there's all sorts of issues like we had contracts where we had to keep recordings for every single phone call that went on. For the life of the contract we had with the jail, plus an additional number of years. And these jails didn't pay for anything.
Oh,
We basically made all of the money off of the back of the customer, like the literal people who made the phone calls. So it was really bizarre working on a platform that was basically software as a service, that the people who paid for the service were not the people who were buying it, but the people who were using it.
wow, that's that's something. Yeah, there. So like, so what are the security challenges there? Do you need to tap calls a specific way? Is there people listening into calls? Can you
Yeah,
even
yeah.
tell us?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean every call that went out through the platform by default was recorded. Now, of course, we had
Mm,
to build security considerations because if somebody needs to call their lawyer, that needs to be not recorded and not being able to be monitored as well, because legal rights and stuff like that. So the software had to take that into account. That if the number was in a number list, that basically we built, that it would not turn on the recording and it would not allow someone to actually monitor the call. And that was one of the difficult things we ran into. Was as we looked at different platforms, we had to be able to record multiple legs of a phone call and basically bridge all those legs together, because the we had a web platform for monitoring, which was that was a big nightmare back when I
mm.
first started working there, because the web didn't really have a really good way of doing VoIP uh, directly in a browser. Because one of the problems we had is, these jails and prisons, they typically have old machines that are running like Windows. If you're lucky, back then it was running Windows Vista. A lot of the machines back then at that point in time, this is 10 years ago, back when Windows 7
So you
was.
had Flash available as the only thing?
No, we couldn't install Flash.
Oh
That
wow.
was, yeah, these were government PCs, so we couldn't install, like, we if we were lucky, we could install an ActiveX control into Internet Explorer. And so that's what we focused our, because we couldn't, have them install Chrome. We couldn't have them install Firefox. That was just off the table. Any kind of custom software had to be go through like layers of approval typically.
No Java applets even, I suppose.
Yep,
Because
no Java applets.
which
So
weren't too bad at the time, I want it to be super fair.
yeah, yeah. So it was a huge challenge. So we found there was an ActiveX control that we found at the time,
Mm.
and I'm trying to remember the name. I can't remember the name of that thing. So we embedded an ActiveX control in the web page that would auto install, and on occasion we still had issues with it. Um, but as time moved on, it was just one of the things. Well, it works, and we only support IE, and all these people are on older browsers, anyways, older computers. So we didn't bother upgrading it, just because of the fact that it was one of those things where we were kind of aiming further ahead and wanting to skip um, over. We were waiting for WebRTC to become more prevalent, and we knew with our platform upgrade and WebRTC that it was one of those things that was going to be solved for us. We would just be able to
Yeah.
easily conference in stuff using WebRTC. We could add our monitoring solution into the web, and then everything would just work, and we wouldn't have to worry about any third-party software. It would just be built into the solution. Um, Funny thing is, we ran into an issue in Windows 10 as our client started upgrading to Windows 10, where certain Dell machines, and Dell obviously is huge in the industry, especially in government industry and stuff like that. Um, there was a weird issue where Dell machines, if what was it? If the
A specific brand?
Yeah, well, and it was because of the firmware on um, the motherboard that they were using. So if the default mic on the system was selected, um, it
Oh,
would it would basically cause the VoIP software to not be able to um, actually select the microphone, and so it wouldn't connect, and you would get no audio whatsoever. And it would just basically it would act like it was connected, and it would send empty RTP packets back and forth, and basically it just wouldn't initialize the engine. That was a fun one to trying to track down. So
Wow.
yeah, we run into all sorts of weird issues just because of the fact that we were dealing with these, government systems, and we weren't dealing with the most modern technology most of the time.
Yeah, this so for my younger colleagues and friends in the audience, that's where my frequent remarks about those youngsters having it easy these days come from. Like
Yeah.
it's not. I have proof. Zach here can testify that I'm not making things up. We had to literally figure out how and why one computer, which was from a specific brand and model, wasn't able to run an obscure ActiveX control that we had found on the internet and modified just so we can place a phone call.
Yep. Yeah, that was life.
Yeah. Nowadays, you just download FreeSwitch, get Asterisk, careful JavaScript files, done. You
Oh
have
yeah. Well, like, so the platform that we were working on when I first started there at Paytel was it was a piece of software called Aculab, which was built by this Israeli company back in the early 90s, and they had been on that platform since basically it was invented, and they had paid Aculab to specifically modify their SIP software to work with a raw socket connection to it, so that they could build basically a SIP engine, or a voice tree to control the thing, because everything there was custom software. And then two, built it to work with the hardware that we were using at the time, which were, what was the name of the I can't remember what our ADAC system was called, but basically built it to work with our ADACs. Um, and so it was just really, really old software. It was written in C, I think it was. It only ran on Linux. You could not virtualize it.
why?
We never could figure out exactly why, but if you tried to run it on a virtual machine, it just
Mhm.
one, it would randomly close the control socket, so it just wouldn't work. And two, they claimed, because they had a hardware license key at first, because this was, almost 20 years ago when they first bought this software, when hardware license keys were, relatively common. And they claimed that their their virtual license key would work just fine, and they gave it to us and it never worked. So we had to pay them boatloads of money to basically do all the modifications they had done to the really old version of their platform on their new version of their platform, just so that we could try to virtualize the platform to kind of hobble along for a couple of more years while we worked on the migration to Asterisk.
Wow, that's yeah. Hardware keys, guys. You had it.
Yeah.
We have it easy right now. Hardware keys. That's a. This still exists though. Like in my father's company, they're running some communication software that controls some machinery, and they still have those hardware keys. And one of
Mhm.
them is I've been trying to help in spare time find a solution, because one of them is from a company that no longer exists. And as far as we know, that key is the only one in existence.
Oof.
So
Yeah.
there's virtualization software that allows you to make a copy that will still preserve the legality of having a copy. Like it will make sure you're only using one and
Hmm.
whatnot. There's a few ways, but it's the first thing those softwares say is you might incur in total loss of data. This might just not work anymore. So what do you do?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. And you built the your platform mostly in open source software like Asterisk and other components. Just
Yeah.
curious.
So when I started there, that was one of the things that, everything that back then was closed source when I
Mm.
first started there. And after about 5 years, when we started looking at how we were going to migrate the platform, um, we started looking all throughout the community. We looked at all the open source software, all the closed source software, just to try and figure out what was going to be our best way of going about it. We even, at the time, I went through and read the SIP white paper. Thankfully, most of that has been purged from my brain, because that was, oh, don't, if you ever have the chance, try to avoid reading SIP white papers. They'll put you to sleep. Uh, we even thought about writing our own SIP engine at one point in time. And so we looked at pretty much everything out there. Uh, an asterisk at the time, ARI was still relatively fresh. It was maybe around the time of Asterisk 12 or 13. So ARI had been out for maybe 2 or 3 releases, and basically what we did is we just did a like a 3-week quick code jam with me and 3 other developers, and we each pulled a platform and wrote a very quick proof of concept on top of the APIs that were available for each of the engines, and Asterisk won it out. And so since we were building on top of Asterisk, I talked with the president of the company and the head of IT at that point in time, and convince them that we could build and give back to the fact that we were basically getting this technology for free is a way to give back to the community. We wanted to um, take the base engine that we were building without all of the industry specific and our IP based tech, and deliver that out to the public. So there's an MIT licensed IVR
Mm.
built on ASP.NET Core. Well, it's actually just .NET Core, and this was we originally released it. It was .NET Core 1, and it's since been upgraded all the way. Right now, it's at 3.1, or actually, it's on .NET Core 5, and the 6.0 upgrade is planned for the next couple of weeks. And it's called Arke, ARKE.
Hmm.
Um,
Great.
and yeah, so it was one of our the things that I pushed really hard for. And so now at this point in time, they're still not heavily involved in open source over there, but
Mm.
it was one of those things that we tried to kind of push them to do, since we were using a lot of more open source tech as I was taking over more of the technology decisions of the company at that point in time.
Nice. Well, since you mentioned it, maybe I will not maybe I'd really like to ask you all about the Microsoft environment and how people can actually do open source work on .NET, etc. Because I have to be honest, I've been in the industry for 22 years at this point, plus change during university. And one of the platforms I've used the least is the various iterations of Visual Basic, then .NET, etc. Just because I know different angles, still like stuff, than Python and Ruby, than JavaScript. So it's a different world than what I'm used to being in. But I hear great things. We have a lot of customers using that, and people might not be aware there's a very good open source environment there.
Yeah. So, and a couple of years ago, I think it was 2017. Oh, it's more than a couple of years at this point. When I spoke at Astrocon, I was surprised. Like, I had maybe a dozen people show up to my press conference, and I think that's because of the fact that I was the only person at the conference that was talking about .NET.
Mm.
Um, at the time, .NET Core 2 had just been released, so roughly, I want to say it was about 8 years ago now. Microsoft. Um, in the .NET division decided that they were going to basically try what was originally an experiment years ago with the Microsoft or with the .NET Portable library, to build a truly cross-platform .NET. Um, and so they created what was called .NET Core. And .NET Core is the first iteration of .NET that was truly cross-platform. And I mean, it worked on Windows, it worked on Linux, it worked on Mac, it worked on Raspberry Pi. You could run it on pretty much everything, and everything was completely open sourced. So they open sourced the entire framework, um, and it's available on GitHub. Microsoft basically bought GitHub shortly after this happened, and they decided to basically build the next iteration of .NET with the community together. And so the first iteration of .NET Core was roughly about 20% faster than .NET Framework. And a lot of that is because they stripped a lot of features out in the first iteration that were Windows specific that they
Mm.
just couldn't do at the time. Um, and so it was one of those things where it was a dramatic shift. Um, so as that has progressed, now .NET 6 is incredibly fast, incredibly lightweight, and it's still completely open source. The everything from the compiler, which is codename Roslyn, which is your C# compiler, um, through every single library in the framework is complete source and available on GitHub. And so, because of that, Microsoft's really kind of fostered that open source, mantra within the company. The language now is open source and a standard. The compiler is open source, and now the framework is open source. And you can target and build on just about any platform. And if you don't have a platform, obviously you could port it if you really needed to.
Hmm. Okay, so what's the main language of the platform? It's C Sharp, right?
Yeah, yeah. C sharp is kind of the bread and butter. There's also F sharp, which is the functional language, also written by Anders. And then Visual Basic is still supported. Not many people actually, obviously write in VB. VB has very much become like the legacy old enterprise language that's kind of hanging around by a thread, much like COBOL and stuff like that. So
It's interesting. It still exists, honestly.
I know it is. It still exists and it's still supported. You can write .NET Core and .NET 6 code with VB. It's kind of
Wow,
weird that you can, but
that's a very good way to put it. Yeah, it's kind of weird that you actually allowed to, but still.
yeah. So it's one of those interesting things. And now they've with .NET Core they've added support for there's a new UI library out there, this
Mhm.
cross-platform UI library, so you can build desktop applications for Linux using C sharp and .NET.
Wow. Aside from well, desktop is surely interesting, but I'm curious. So you could build applications in C Sharp for Linux on the command line, right? There is a tool, there is a
Yeah,
framework
so
to do.
what was it? It used to be around, and now it's basically rolled into .NET. It started with an M, and I'm trying to remember the name of the old
Mono.
framework. Yeah, Mono. Yeah, yeah. So Mono was that community open source framework for C Sharp and .NET that was Linux cross platform. Microsoft bought Mono and basically turned that into what became the Android library, Xamarin. They
Hmm.
rolled Mono in because the Xamarin project when they bought Xamarin was also using Mono. So they basically rolled those two together, and it basically exclusively became their Android platform until .NET 6 rolled around. .NET 6 actually introduces Android into the .NET uh, standard. The um,
So it
Mono
actually came
platform.
from an open source effort. That's cool.
Yeah, yeah. So Mono started as an open source effort, and then when Microsoft bought Mono, they decided, that was when they folded the developers from Mono into Microsoft. I think that's where a lot of the pressure to open up and really start to build a open source version of .NET came from. Now, of course, that's speculation, but that you can look at the timeline and the stars kind of aligned that as Mono and Xamarin got bought by Microsoft, you can start to see that push, especially around the time Satya Nadella took over. There was definitely a huge push with Satya to really invest in open source technology within Microsoft and kind of change the culture there.
It really feels like it has benefited Microsoft quite a lot, though. It's
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of goodwill with the community. C sharp, I think now is the second most popular language on Stack Overflow and GitHub. I might be
wow.
wrong on that, but it definitely climbed up. I know it used to be really far down the list, even though it was usually like a second or third most popular language on Stack Overflow. GitHub new projects, C sharp had half the years didn't even show up on the popular new projects
For
list,
sure, yeah.
and now it's I think number two, maybe number three. It's up there. Obviously, JavaScript is still number one, but
I have to say that people know, so it's not disclosing any industrial secrets. Most of our internal, let's say, messaging, the glue stuff that makes SignalWire tick,
mhm.
is built in C Sharp.
Oh,
We
okay,
have a lot. We have a sort of large team internally, and it's there's a lot in there. And I have to say, the few times I've looked at C Sharp code, I've built some demos. I've learned at least some of the ASP.NET Core things. And yeah, that as an aside, I think the only problem in I call it the C Sharp environment, .NET, whatever. Yeah,
yeah,
the problem is naming. Like, can people figure out a way to give things names that are
yeah,
coherent? I see it. I can see that Microsoft wants to preserve the some kind of a product line style thing, right? So web-based stuff is always ASP,
Yeah.
whatever the whatever. But it's I mean, from our point of view, and that's something that maybe you that I actually I like your opinion on. From our point of view as developers of third-party APIs, and we build SDKs, we have to show people when you're going into building demos for people, and you do say a live event or a blog post, whatever.
Mhm.
I feel like the audience is having trouble figuring out what thing they need to download, because it's all named the same.
Yeah, and the nice thing is that they've done a little bit of work with that with .NET 6, especially if you use the CLI. Um, with the CLI, you can create a new project just by typing .NET new, and then basically you tell it what you want. Do you want a web API? Do you want a SPA? Do you want a console application? Do you want a desktop Windows application? And then it just kind of does what you need. And then after that, obviously you have to use the NuGet package manager, and that's where things get a little bit fun. And that's just basically learning how to search through GitHub so that you can find a project that you need, and then they'll tell you what you need to install package wise. But
Probably,
yeah,
yeah, NuGet is probably not. It's middle of the pack when it comes to quality of package managers. It's
yeah,
not Ruby's bundler, which is probably the absolute best that
true.
ever. But it's not the first iterations of JavaScript's package manager.
Yeah, npm. Yeah. It's not npm where you get this massive tree of nested dependencies that you. Yeah. Oh yeah.
To be fair, the problem with npm is very often the people releasing packages like the infamous pad left library, or
Hmm.
libraries who have only one method, which I don't know, turns every double space into a single space.
Yep.
Yep, guys, that pulls in 100Ks of dependencies. Just write the method.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. Which and that's been the fun journey as a Microsoft developer, is watching the competition between the .NET team and the Node team. So when .NET Core 1 came out, the Node team started like trash talking. They were like, "Oh, you've built this new platform and it's so slow," because Node was still roughly about 2 or 3 times faster.
Mm.
Um, so when .NET Core 2 came out, the .NET Core team basically decided it took that as a challenge. And at the announcement for .NET Core 2, they brought this game studio that was building their backend platform for this web-based MMO um, on, and basically showed it was something like 8 to 10 times faster than Node.js at floating point mathematics, which is one of the hardest,
Yeah.
things obviously for a platform to do. And they rolled all these benchmarks out where it was just thrashing Node left and right. Um, and then .NET Core 2.1 came out, and they kind of took on uh, Nginx, where
Oh, wow.
Nginx was trash talking the .NET Core host and saying, "Oh well, you can't even host a static web page fast enough to matter." Well, then they came out and they were showing that their performance was 20 to 30% faster than Nginx in the base static web platform hosting. So the team really took to heart like any trash talk from the industry and took it as a challenge, and because of that now, I mean, it's flip flop back and forth. So like .NET Core 2 to 3, like Node took back over, and then 3.1, Microsoft took over, and so it's been a little bit of back and forth, which is always good for a community. When you get a little bit of trash talking that
To be
invigorates the
fair,
team to do better.
and honest, I think that shows why Microsoft is a good player to have in the industry, not a bad player like everybody. There's opinions around. I'm no Rachel Stallman. I'll use whatever works. I have a
Yeah,
Mac and I'm super happy about it, but I've used Windows for years, of course. The idea there is that Microsoft can do pretty much whatever they set their minds to, just because of the amount of resources they have, which means it's a good thing to have because the tools are great, honestly.
oh yeah, I mean they build the best tools on the market just about. That's one of the reasons why I became a .NET developer, is because Visual Studio is just, it's a joy to use, and compared to where I was at before, I was working in a Java shop and using Radware from IBM,
Oh yeah.
and this was obviously 12 years ago. Yeah, I've been in the industry for 12 years now. Um, when I made the switch. So at the time, I think it was Redware 6. So it was based on Eclipse, but it
Mhm.
was a really badly bastardized version of Eclipse. So it's,
And
it's one of those things like,
Eclipse wasn't great already, to be
yeah,
fair.
Eclipse was not great at that point in time. I don't know how it is now. I've, kind of left the Java world behind and happily not looked back.
I've
But
used Eclipse for a while as a general purpose IDE when you were doing, Ruby stuff, etc.
yeah.
I tried it out. I've done a lot, and I'm using Vim now, and I'm super happy about Vim with like 3 plugins.
Yeah, and so well, and the nice thing about the .NET world is we now have basically our version of IntelliJ, which IntelliJ, from what I understand, is actually really good. And I would kind of agree with that because basically I use the C# mirror of that writer from the company that makes all that software,
Hmm.
JetBrains.
Yeah, right,
And
right. JetBrains.
Rider is fantastic. You can run it pretty much anywhere, and it's a relatively cheap IDE. Um, Actually, is it free for Rider? No, no, Rider is a paid product, I think. It might have a free version. I don't know. But I use that, I can pull up in a Linux VM if I need to, run it. I can run it on Mac OS, which obviously right now Visual Studio on Mac OS still needs some work. VS Code is perfect if you don't need a full debugger and everything like that. But
Oh yeah, but I think honestly, 80 to 90% of developers I work with use VS Code at this point.
oh, I know
The ones
it's
that are not using full Visual Studio, or me and the other two, we are using Vim. All of the others are using VS Code.
yeah, yeah. I use VS Code for pretty much anything that's not something I need to debug heavily. So if I'm just writing code and I know what I'm doing, and I don't need to step through the debugger and use all of the performance tooling and stuff like that Visual Studio has, I'm in VS Code most of the time because
I think
it's
the
so fast.
performance tooling is the important part. Like the performance tooling is really good.
Yeah,
Super really good.
yeah. Performance profiling and all the architecture tools in Visual Studio are just one of those things that once you get used to having them, you will scream and kick and shout if somebody tries to rip them away.
Wow, yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's simply an awesome platform.
Hmm.
Well, we've gone through a lot. It's very interesting finding out how a prison system, phone system works, and really, it's interesting. Yeah, points you make about phones need to be sturdy, but not sturdy enough,
Yeah.
or so you can't use them as a weapon. And it's all based on open source and .NET. Really, guys, like go find out about .NET. And I personally think it's giving Golang and a couple of those other newer tools a run for its money, even for on system style programming. Like if you're doing work queues, processing,
Hmm.
it's really fast. To be fair, it's super fast, and
Yeah.
it makes more sense than Node. But don't tell anyone. This is not being recorded, so it doesn't. I never could wrap my. I'm a Rubyist. I come from a world where everything I write makes a lot of sense, and I could never wrap my head around the amount of boilerplate code you have in Node.
Oh yeah, yeah. And, the thing that always drove me crazy about JavaScript. Thankfully, most of that has been fixed with TypeScript. Which the interesting thing is TypeScript, the language was built by the guy who built C sharp. It's the same guy, Anders, and I always forget his last name because it's so hard to say.
Which makes sense though to have to know that it has been built by the same people,
Yeah,
right?
so if you love TypeScript and you've never looked at C sharp, basically C sharp is where TypeScript came from. C sharp was Microsoft's version of Java, is what a lot of people call it, but most of us that know the history of Java and the history of C sharp, some people call it Java plus plus,
Oh,
because basically it's the evolution of Java. They took the idea that Java was, which was a really good idea, and honestly, if it weren't for Oracle, I think Java would be in a much better place today. Uh, but they took the idea of Java and of taking the
mm,
syntax and basically simplifying it and building a managed platform around it. And
making
they
it
kind of took it to the
sane.
next step.
Yeah,
And
making it sane in a sense. I always
yeah, oh yeah,
call it like
absolutely.
yeah, yeah. Well, one day I want to do an episode about where did Java go with someone who's still in that side of the industry? Because honestly, I don't even know. Like, I know there's people doing that, working on Java, that are making good money because there's a lot of demand. So I
Yeah.
suppose people are using it. It's just so weird that it's so tangential to what we do. Like, I never met a company who was using Java, and I work at a large company with a lot of large customers.
Yeah, I noticed when I was doing a lot of the SIP research that everybody in the biggest language I saw was actually Python, which really surprised me that Python was bigger than everything else because I always thought of Python as a hobbyist language, not as a serious enterprise language. Just
It's
because of
easy
the
to learn, has good tooling, and to be fair, is probably slightly better than Ruby in many instances, including performance. So that's where that comes from, most likely.
yeah, well, and it does a lot of things really well, especially like string manipulation and stuff like that. It does it better than anybody else. So yeah, it was a really interesting eye-opening thing to see how prevalent Python was in the industry, compared to what I had always expected. I expected honestly to find that Java was the most prevalent language, and found it was probably one of the worst at the time as I was doing that research. That everybody had kind of abandoned it.
Another language that refuses to go away is PHP.
Mm, yeah, you're telling me.
It's just still hanging on. Like, there's so
Yep.
many people doing PHP that is probably gonna stay forever. PHP 8 is not bad at all, by the way.
Oh, really?
I worked on a new version of our SDK because nobody else wanted to or had time, and it turned out pretty well. It's good. It has command line tooling. It's been decoupled by having to run on a web server and only a web server. It is usable, which is fine, I guess. It's still whatever. It's uh, well, JavaScript was born to make animated monkeys dance. Let's look at that. And PHP actually was something like that. It's was CGI plus. Then we decided it was a good thing. But I mean, I've done PHP for years, and there's plenty of good users. But PHP has a great community that's divided as usual in some great developers and a lot of people who should be doing something else. But that's the same for most popular languages, to be fair. I think C
Yeah.
Sharp has a better average quality, probably because it's a little bit harder to get into, not by much, but
Well, it's the barrier to entry has dropped, but it used to be kind of protected behind Visual Studio. So if you didn't have a Visual Studio license, you weren't doing C sharp back then. And then slowly that barrier to entry has been removed as the Mono project came along and they released their open source compiler. So then you could actually compile a Mono without Visual Studio. And then there were open source projects to support it and stuff like that. So it's better. Thankfully, it looks like Pearl has finally died.
uh it hasn't. And I'm not allowed to say why I can say this, but trust me.
There's there's still Pearl. Oh God, that
There
was
is Perl somewhere in what we're using.
oh God, that was the one that used to give me nightmares. 20 years ago was trying to learn Pearl.
Perl is fantastic. It's kind of like Lua. It's fantastic at being a one-shot scripting piece that you need embedded in a larger process. That's fine, I guess. If you're running some things, it works. But yeah, it's been a while since I've seen Perl used a lot. Actually,
Yeah,
great.
well, as somebody
So
who started with the C syntax, learning Perl was just like it didn't make any sense.
no, it's very different. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Zach, for joining us today. It was a pleasure chatting with you. We went through so many topics that I want to recap. I think people had a great time watching and learning something from you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
And for everybody else, I'll see you next week. Thank you.